Hello everyone, and welcome to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series in which we take a look at Precon decks and bring them up to cut rate standards. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Mind Flayer Precon from Battle for Baldur's Gate and its face commander, Captain Ghathrod, which we'll be bringing up from its roughly $40 price point to an increased budget of $75 after upgrades. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what Precon upgrade from Battle for Baldur's Gate we'll be covering next. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Captain Ghathrod is a 3/6 horror pirate that costs 3 a blue and a black with the following abilities. Horrors we control have menace. Whenever a horror we control deals combat damage to a player, that player mills that many cards. At the beginning of our end step, choose target artifact or creature card in an opponent's graveyard that was put there from their library this turn. Put it into the battlefield under our control. Breaking down our commander's core stats, Ghathrod is sporting a somewhat heavy CMC, a very defensive stat block for the cost, and a set of abilities that empower our horrors by granting them evasion and mill when they connect, as well as reanimating our choice of the best creature or artifact milled by our opponents each turn. Taking a look at Ghathrod's horror-focused abilities first, the evasion and on-damage mill they provide all our horrors is a bit more impressive than it may first seem. While menace certainly isn't the most impressive form of evasion, horrors have access to both creatures with huge stat blocks whose added menace will make them very costly to block, as well as creatures with other forms of evasion which menace can improve on even further to make them even trickier to block effectively. And with our horrors more easily getting in for damage, their newly acquired mill can be used to power up the mill-focused payoffs horrors have at their disposal to make them even more dangerous. But that mill's real purpose is to enable Ghathrod's last ability, which, at the end of our turn, lets us bring back our choice of artifact or creature we milled off an opponent that turn into play under our control at no cost, which can range from mana rocks to utility creatures on the low end, and all the way up to game warping and backbreaking creatures and artifacts at the top end and everything in between, making it quite a potent but self-scaling ability that's only as powerful as the contents of the decks we're playing against. And since this procs off any cards milled regardless of their source, we can combine Demir's access to superb mill and the mill provided by our horrors to ensure we can get the absolute best resources from our opponent's bins turn after turn. So, as we can see, Captain Ghathrod is part horror tribal, part mill, and part reanimator/theft, aiming to use our horrors to mill our opponents as they connect using their newfound evasion, supplemented by other mill sources to chew through our opponent's decks even faster, and then returning the choicest creatures and artifacts we mill to use against their owners. So, to maximize his capabilities, we'll be improving all 3 of these categories to make Ghathrod as deadly as possible. On the horror front, we'll be keeping the most powerful horrors from the core build, specifically those with built-in evasion or other forms of mill to fill our opponent's graveyards reliably, and supplementing their numbers with even more small to mid-sized evasive horrors to ensure we have plenty of them on board when our commander drops to start milling our opponents right away. Speaking of mill, we'll of course be holding on to the most powerful horror and non-horror sources of it out of the box, and building upon it even further with continual sources of repeatable mill to ensure Captain Ghathrod will still have the option to reanimate even if our horrors are unable to attack, and allowing us to dig even deeper into our opponent's decks if they are. And finally, alongside our commander and other additional forms of enemy reanimation included in the base build, we'll be adding even more ways to get resources out of our opponent's graveyards, turning every single card we mill from our opponents into another potential threat that they may end up having to face themselves. So, let's set sail on the Astral Sea with the Mind Flayer Captain Ghathrod at the helm. For too long has this captain been without a ship, but now, with a new spelljammer and a crew of horrors at the ready, they're eager to set sail to pillage and steal once more. And our opponents appear to be just the targets to sate their desires, both for coin in their chests and for brains in their bellies. So, now that we have a better understanding of the commander and playstyle, let's look at the cards we'll be keeping from the base build. Starting with our kept creatures first, we'll quickly run down the horrors that made it in from the core build to be empowered by our commander. Beginning with our evasive horrors, Dothy Horror, Overcharged Amalgam, and Guilt Feeder all make it in thanks to being able to easily crack in for damage, the first 2 being able to trigger our commander's mill, and the last being a powerful mill payoff that can easily one-shot our opponents once their graveyards get full. Brainstealer Dragon then joins us as our last evasive carryover, whose combination of enormous stat block and flying work perfectly with our commander to mill huge swaths of cards off our opponent's decks, while its abilities allow us to steal even more cards from our opponents and drain their life away for every one we play to eliminate them even faster. Then moving on from evasive horrors to huge horrors, Hunted Horror keeps its spot by being a 2-mana 7/7 trampler that, while it may give our opponent's creatures, we can easily give those creatures to an opponent we don't plan on attacking, or simply get over them with our other evasive creatures as we turn our Hunted Horror elsewhere. Hullbreaker Horror also makes it into this category, being an enormous body with pseudo haste thanks to its flash and providing us with a repeatable source of bounce and soft countering, making it quite a powerful and flexible horror to have in our arsenal. Sludge Monster then wraps up our naturally big horrors, its decent bulk allowing it to make good use out of the evasion and mill our commander provides, as well as being a very annoying form of removal that turns the nastiest threat on the table into a vanilla 2/2 which we can then easily run over. Then proceeding to our mill-focused horrors, both Nemesis of Reason and Zealous Sanity Flayer make the grade as solid forms of repeatable mill. The former's mill 10 on attack and large bulk, allowing it to fill our opponent's bins quite quickly and safely, while the latter's cheap activatable mill 3 is solid enough, and its ability to flood our board with 1/1 horrors as we mill being decent upside to screen attacks with or swing in for even more mill. In a similar vein, Sewer Nemesis and Consuming Aberration also carry over from the core build, both giving us access to even more mill as we and our opponents play cards, all the while becoming enormous as we mill to put Captain Negathrod's granted evasion and mill to even better use. And finally, closing out our creature holdovers with some utility horrors, both Aboleth Spawn and Grell Philosopher keep their spots by providing us with even further means to steal effects from our opponents for free, from their ETB effects and in-play artifacts respectively, while Grazzelix Illithid Scholar makes it in as a reliable source of draw to ensure our hands stay nice and full as our evasive horrors crack in for damage and mill. Moving on to our instant keepers, Drown in the Loch makes it in as a superb mill payoff to both cheaply counter spells and remove creatures once our mill plan is underway. Memory Plunder keeps its spot by providing us the means to steal instants and sorceries from our opponent's graveyards to lean even heavier into our theft game plan. And lastly, Curtain's Call makes the grade by virtue of being a superb 2-for-1 removal spell for only 3 CMC thanks to Undaunted to provide our build with some no-nonsense and effective creature removal. Our kept sorceries are then up next, starting with the removal option, Feed the Swarm, which stays in due to being one of the few ways our colors are able to deal with enchantments while also being a passable removal option for creatures if needed. Siphon Mind also makes the cut, being an excellent source of draw that also strips resources away from our opponent's hands that, while it does not directly support our commander, does enable our other graveyard theft effects so they have even more targets to hit. Graveyard theft effects like Extract from Darkness, From the Catacombs, and Psionic Ritual, all of which carry over by giving us even more ways to weaponize our opponent's graveyards against them, with the added mill, reusability, and Undercity Venturing and horror-focused replication being solid upsides as well. Skipping kept enchantments, since none from the core build carried over, we'll move straight to our kept artifacts. Starting off with the Mana Rocks Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, Mind Stone, Talisman of Dominance, and Thought Vessel, all of which make the final build by being excellent sources of ramp to help speed up and fix our mana base, as does Dimir Key Rune, which also does this but has the added benefit of also turning itself into an evasive horror to give us access to more mill alongside our commander. Then, for our last 2 artifact holdovers, Mind Crank stays in for effectively doubling the mill our commander provides our horrors to allow them to fill our opponent's bins even faster, and Lightning Greaves stay in as well to keep Captain Negathrod protected from our opponent's removal once they start getting sick of having to fight their own creatures turn after turn. Skipping over Planeswalkers since none were included in the base build, we'll move right to our kept land base, with Command Tower and Exotic Orchard both staying in as reliable sources of mana from either our commander's color identity or our opponent's lands. Path of Ancestry keeps its spot by tapping for both our colors and also tacking on a free scry as we summon our horrors with its mana. Choked Estuary, Darkwater Catacombs, Sunken Hollow, Tainted Isle, and River of Tears all make it in as solid dual lands that usually come into play untapped to help speed up our mana base. Creeping Tar Pit and Temple of Deceit stay in as well, the evasive body and scry they provide making them worth running despite coming into play tapped, as does Myriad Landscape for the ramp it provides us access to from our land slot. The utility lands Nephalia Drownyard and Rogue's Passage will also keep their spots, both giving our build even more access to mill with their activated ability and evasion granting to our horrors respectively, helping us keep our opponent's bins nice and full to enable our commander and other graveyard payoffs. And finally, 9 islands and 11 swamps make it in as our basics to round out our mana base. That leaves us with a final tally of 65 cards including basic lands we'll be keeping from the base build, leaving us with 35 cards to replace. So, now that we've covered all the cards that made the cut from the core build, let's move on to our upgrades. Starting off with our creature upgrades, we'll first be swapping out the less impressive horrors from the core build and replacing them with evasive ones that work better alongside our commander. Dross Harvester and Phyrexian Rager, for example, are a bit too underwhelming to work with our game plan, so we'll be swapping them out for Fright Crawler and Bone Shard Slasher, both of which are cheap evasive horrors to drop early and later get bigger as our graveyard grows to mill out our opponents even more efficiently. Quickly running down our other evasive horror swaps, Phyrexian Revoker, whose ability is powerful but a bit too niche for our needs, will be cut in favor of Changeling Outcast, which is another source of dirt cheap tribal unblockability to drop early and get in for damage as soon as our commander hits the board. Night Howler, who needs some setup to get going, and Plague Spitter, whose AoE damage hurts our small evasive horrors too much, both get exchanged out for Faceless Devourer and Wrathy Intimidator, both of whom are again hard to block horrors to get in for damage and mill, with the latter even letting us tutor up Changeling Outcast if needed. And finally, Chasm Skulker, Woe Strider, and Uchalan, all of which are solid horrors and could have remained in this build, will be replaced with Wasp of Bitter End, Possessed Avian, and Stitchwing Scab, whose built-in evasion is better for us to set up our board in the early game before our commander drops to get the mill plan started right away. Then we'll be swapping in one more non-evasive horror, replacing Duskmangler, who'd find a better home in a more flicker-focused build, with Arvinox the Mind Flayer, whose huge stat block comes online very quickly thanks to our commander's theft effect, and gives us even more options to steal from our opponent's decks turn after turn. Now, with our evasive horrors optimized, we'll move on to add some non-horror creatures that fit with our mill-heavy and graveyard theft playstyle. To start, we'll be replacing Forgotten Creation, Psychosis Crawler, and Wharf Infiltrator, whose wheel, burn, and discard payoffs don't exactly mesh well with our game plan, with the clones Shadowkin, Dimir Doppelganger, and Body Double, all of whom get us additional copies of our opponent's creatures as we mill them away or they're destroyed through other means to get us even more value out of their graveyards. Similarly, Mind Flayer, whose theft effect is nice but a bit too off-theme for what we're aiming for, will be cut in favor of Lazov Dimir Mastermind, who's not only a clone we can swap on the fly if a better target becomes available, but whose built-in hexproof makes whatever threat he transforms into even more difficult for our opponents to interact with. Then moving away from clones and onto more grave robbing, the expensive but underwhelming Dark Hatchling and Nihilith, along with the solid but a bit out of place in this build Ravenous Chupacabra, will all get the axe to make room for Rakshasa Debaser, Rexel the Risen Deep, and Ghathrod of the Vault. The first two allowing us to steal even more resources from our opponent's bins for free every time they swing in, and the last having us pay for his reanimation effect but milling our opponents further when we do so to fill up our opponent's bins even faster. All three also possessing decent stat blocks to crash into our opponents for damage as well. And finally, for our last creature swap, we'll be cutting Spellkite, whose protection effect is nice but we'll be replacing with better options later, for Burnished Heart, whose ramp helps us get to the 5 mana we need to cast our commander and get our game plan rolling as soon as possible. Moving on to our instant upgrades, we'll be aiming to tack on some additional mill to our core stats to enable our commander and other graveyard payoffs as we use them, with Factor Fiction and Pull from Tomorrow, both of which are excellent card draw sources, being exchanged for Drown in Dreams and Grisly Spectacle, both of which fulfill our core stats with draw and removal respectively while adding in some solid mill to load up our opponent's bins. The sorcery upgrades will then follow a similar trend, with the pure mill spell Fractured Sanity being swapped out in favor of Pilfered Plants to dig deeper into our own deck while still milling our opponents, and the powerful but mana-hungry Angarrick's Wake being cut for Life's Finale instead, which is still a solid board wipe but also a graveyard tutor for our opponents to set up their bins with their most powerful creatures for us to reanimate later. Then continuing on to our enchantment upgrades, the horror payoffs Endless Evil, Haunted One, and Reflections of Letjara all fail to make it in since we've downsized the amount of horrors we're running, and are instead being exchanged for Court of Cunning, Patient Rebuilding, and Reconnaissance Mission. The first two providing us with repeatable draw and mill to keep our hands topped off while filling our opponent's graveyards, and the last making all our evasive horrors even more potent by having them draw us cards as they crack in to mill our opponents turn after turn. Quickly running down our artifact upgrades, we'll be swapping out the powerful Leyline of Anticipation for Wayfarer's Bauble, the cheap ramp it provides us being preferable over playing at instant speed since we'll be needing to mill our opponents on our turns anyway, the subpar lands Ash Barrens and Dimir Aqueduct along with a somewhat random inclusion of Everflowing Chalice will be cut in favor of Felwar Stone, Charcoal Diamond, and Sky Diamond, all of which give us cheap access to colored mana to more quickly reach our commander and other high CMC creatures. The lackluster wipes Crippling Fear and Hex get the axe to make room for Swiftfoot Boots and Whispersilk Cloak, both of whom provide our commander and other top-end creatures with solid targeted removal protection along with haste and unblockability respectively to allow them to get into combat more easily. Black Market's powerful but slow ramp is exchanged out for Bident of Thassa, which like Grazzelix and Reconnaissance Mission before it makes all our evasive horrors into repeatable sources of card advantage, while its activated ability to force attacks can help break stalled board states. And lastly, Herald's Horn fails to make it in alongside our other horror payoffs since the final build doesn't have enough horrors to make the most use out of it, and is instead replaced with Strionic Resonator, which can cheaply double up our commander's end of turn reanimate to get 2 of our opponent's cards into play, quite literally making them twice as effective. And finally, reaching our land upgrades, we'll be swapping out the not-so-good Temple of the False Gods for Shipwrecked Marsh as another dual land that usually comes into play untapped to help us fix our colors, as well as axing the niche port of Karfell and Drown Yard Temple in favor of Castle Lochthwain and Bonder's Enclave, both of which provide us with some solid repeatable draw from our land slot. So, now that we've covered all 35 cards we've upgraded from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. This deck currently has 32 creatures including the commander, 5 instants, 7 sorceries, 3 enchantments, 17 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have a total of 25 horrors, 3 cards that care about horrors, 15 evasive creatures or sources of evasion, 16 cards that mill our opponents, and 15 cards that let us cast, copy, and reanimate our opponent's effects and creatures, leaving us with a solid selection of horrors and a handful of payoffs for them to work alongside our commander, a good number of which are evasive or can be granted evasion to more easily get in for damage and mill our opponents, along with even more sources of mill outside our horrors to fill up their graveyards even faster and means to use their resources against them even more frequently. For general deck stats, we have 13 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 8 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe. Our removal and wipes being a bit lighter than normal since we'll be focusing more on stealing them from our opponents rather than running them ourselves, with our ramp and draw falling within more normal ratios. Looking at our mana curve, we have 3 1-drops, 19 2-drops, 13 3-drops, 11 4-drops, 9 5-drops, 6 6-drops, and 3 7-drops, giving us a mid-weight curve with plenty of cheap evasive horrors and ramp to set up our board in the early game, aiming to get our commander out quickly and begin milling our opponents on the turn they come down to begin stealing their resources as soon as possible. The final price then comes out to be $74.97 after upgrades. This price does not include tax and assumes that the price you paid for the Precon was $40. The price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For further upgrades, Elder Brain can be added in as another top-end horror to steal resources away from our opponent's hands as well as their graveyards. Nautiloid Ship is a great way to blow out an opponent's entire graveyard if they're getting too much value from it while still letting us play creatures from it for free. Reanimate, Animate Dead, and Necromancy are all excellent low-cost reanimation spells that can target any graveyard to get our opponents or our own most powerful creatures back into play. Toxrill the Corrosive is another powerful top-end horror that's worth considering thanks to the AoE debuff and card draw it can provide us that gets better the longer it sticks around. And Thing in the Ice is a powerful tribal wipe that leaves our commander and other evasive horrors untouched after the dust settles so we can continue pillaging our opponent's graveyards. And finally, Phyrexian Obliterator is an overstated horror with trample that puts our opponents in the terrible position of either blocking it and losing permanence, or letting it through and getting milled to proc our commander. Though we will need to keep in mind its high cost, by which I'm referring to both the 4 black pips in its casting cost and the $25 price tag it carries. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. With Mind Flayer covered, our next Precon upgrade will be featuring Draconic Descent and its face commander, Furkrag Cunning Instigator, so look forward to a Draconic Goad-focused build featuring him soon. Before we close out, again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel cannot grow without your support. And if you feel like showing your thanks by keeping me caffeinated while I make these videos, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.